This podcast is being brought to you by Trinity College Dublin. For further information, please visit our website itunes.tcd.ie.
Thank you very much, Michael, and esteemed colleagues, friends. Thank you for coming along this evening for clearly a very special event for me. As Michael said, I suppose like many teachers, I have a varied background, and what I wanted to talk about this evening was to include something of that background with respect to my own research and my own interests in this link between theory and practice. What I have really planned for you is, I'm going to read a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit, and I've got some things I want to show on the PowerPoint, and that's kind of basically the menu for this evening. So I begin. Of all the oppositions that artificially divide education, the most fundamental and the most ruinous is the one that is set up between theory and practice. The very fact that this division constantly reappears in educational debates in virtually the same form would suffice to indicate that the forms of knowledge that it distinguishes are equally indispensable to an educational practice that cannot be reduced either to everyday common pedagogic sense or a science of teaching. It is an opposition which continues to haunt education and research practice to this day. Without stereotyping the two camps, we could sum up the theoretical side as a search for the key to understanding, learning and teaching through refined explanations of classroom processes. These often originate in the natural sciences, psychology, sociology, history and philosophy. Those on the practical side often eschew any form of research or theory because it is perceived as undermining the reality of teacher experience and pupil learning. One educational professor in the UK recently described theory as a virus, apparently infecting everything that it comes across. A statement which somewhat reflects the populist view of teaching and learning that has become fashionable in the UK, as only being about classroom practice, about which theory can have little to say. So if this works, fingers crossed, these are our dramatis personae. Theory and practice. To get involved in taking up one side against another in an inaugural lecture such as this would hardly do justice to an event which comes with its own sense of institutional celebration and investiture, as well as personal delegation and acceptance. In fact, I might note that the same issues of theory and practice could be brought to the event itself, but I'm not going to do that. My main task in this lecture is rather to explore the ways that theory and practice have featured in my own research over a period of almost 30 years now, as an educationalist in a range of professional contexts. By definition, therefore, my talk has a certain biographical perspective with regard to the issues and problems that I faced at a particular point of time in my life. And clearly, the problems that I had as a newly qualified French teacher are never going to be the same as a professorial head of school. To use a phrase borrowed from my friend and mentor, Pierre Bourdieu, I appeal, therefore, for a certain socio-genetic understanding in what I'm about to say. That is to see the world from a particular point of view at particular times and places. However, should I be accused of gravitating towards solipsism or overt subjectivity, I hope that in the course of this lecture, I will show something of the principles which I believe are valid and true for anyone in education, whether teacher, lecturer, researcher, administrator, student, pupil, policymaker, and politician. I'm going to approach this task with reference to the three major strands of my own research: second language learning and teaching, teacher education, and the work of Pierre Bourdieu. But first, I want to set a historical context for theory and practice in education. Of course, for many years, educational theory and educational practice kept their distance. Teaching was seen as a vocation and a craft where traditional values and common sense acted as the best guide for what went on in the classroom. Where educational research took place, the educational context was often incidental to the professional interests of the researchers involved. Interests that often originated in the natural or special sciences, for example, psychology. So this relationship was, it's a bit dark, but a bit like this. You can see the special sciences basically told practice about itself. The onus here was on psychometric testing, statistics, and behavioural science. For example, O'Connor's view of educational theory in the 1950s, such as it was, amounted to seeing theory in terms of the dominant normative scientific paradigm, thus as a way of forming, evaluating, and connecting hypotheses in order to explain particular educational phenomena. For O'Connor, therefore, educational theory needed to be judged by the same standards as scientific theory. The leading exponent of scientific theory, of course, was the Austrian Karl Popper, who argued from the late 1920s that the strength and the descriptive power of any theoretical statement lay not in proving it correct, but by the degree to which it could be falsified. In other words, that it could generate statements that could be shown to be wrong. Anything else was supposition. Worse, it was myth. Knowledge advances as hypotheses are falsified, leading to further refined hypotheses. But what about education? Clearly, not many things in the classroom have a degree of certainty or uncertainty that would satisfy the Popperian criteria. What occurs there rarely has descriptive rigour against which underlying process can be assessed. Rarely is predictive with any degree of confidence. The philosopher Paul Hirst noticed this in the mid-1960s and with his subsequent arguments laid the basis of what we now know as the foundation or the foundational disciplines. Again, there are arrows there. For him, it was not so much that educational theory could not match scientific theory, but that the latter misrepresented and undervalued the place of theory in education. For Hirst, educational theory could provide principles of practice for education through a deeper grasp of the nature of learning, the values which underpinned it, and the background context in which it took place. Just as physics and chemistry drew on mathematics to develop theoretical positions, so educational theory could draw on foundational disciplines such as psychology, philosophy, history, and sociology to develop an appreciation of what to do in practice. It did this by providing principles which could be justified according to the findings and rationale of such disciplines. In other words, theory's role was to tell practice what to do. But what does this mean in practice? When I went to Southampton University as a teacher-educator, I went as a successful modern languages teacher, more or less. French and German were my subjects, and I was an experienced head of department. That particular journey had involved my own personal struggle to master a foreign language, often in a context that was unknown and even alien to me, Southwest France. Becoming a teacher was not very different, this time with the classroom as the alien environment. Later in the 1980s, I'd encountered the antagonism between theory and practice in the master's degree in applied linguistics that I took in London. And when I was speaking to the master's students at the beginning of this academic year, I told the story that when I went for an interview for my master's, and they said, well, why, you're a practicing teacher, why do you want to do this master's certificate? And I told them it's because I wanted to write better worksheets. And I was very surprised that this amused them. This really, why would you want to do that? But for me, of course, if there was no interest in studying anything unless it impacted on my daily experience. Of course, 2 years later, when I completed my MA, I never did learn how to write better worksheets. But my whole relationship to language had changed. This is the point. In the course of learning about a range of theoretical perspectives, like universal grammar, acculturation, the monitor theory, One in particular did strike a chord with me, and that was the ideas based on the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Although he had died in 1932, here was a researcher who seemed to understand my classroom as I thought I did, in the way that language acted as a medium between the individual and the social context, and on a number of levels. This amounted to control of self, others, objects. It was a means of navigating through the world in a socio-cognitive way. It was a vehicle for individual expression. Now, this approach itself, at the time, it was really not terribly popular, but later it became very popular and was used. I guess many of you have heard this metaphor, scaffolding, and it became very popular. That this was what things were about, that you had to scaffold learning, etc., etc., etc. That is in itself the story of the way the zone of proximal development got translated into a popular term, scaffolding, and then applied in a rather simplistic way in practice, is a good story about the relationship between theory and practice. To return to my own experience, I myself was the product of theoretical perspectives in language teaching. I had been taught French using an audiovisual approach. And this is pretty much this. I took this from one of my old school books, Monsieur Lafayette. And we learnt this. Monsieur Lafayette entre dans la salle de classe. And we all repeated, Monsieur Lafayette entre dans la salle de classe. Bonjour les élèves. Bonjour les élèves. Bonjour monsieur. This is the way I was taught French. This method itself was based on a specific theoretical approach, that of behavioral science. Consequently, on the notion that we learn languages essentially as a skill-based activity. As a result, classroom activity, was based around repetition of key phrases with subsequent grammar analysis, leading to testing through dictation, translations, accuracy exercises in reading and writing. I remember as a teacher, when I gave a listening comprehension, we used to, we were trying to help the pupils, so we would read it out almost phonetically. Un jour, il fait beau. This was a listening comprehension. One of the last listening comprehensions I read out, I remember, was about a burglar dressed as a chimpanzee. So the accent was very much on vocabulary, you either know it or you don't, etc., 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 and, dictation. Dictation was never my favorite one. When I was at school, I used to get minus marks in dictation. I don't know how that happened. How can you have a minus mark? Because they took half a mark off for every spelling mistake and a quarter for every accent. So I ended up with like -6, So it was, this was the way I persevered. While I was teaching, however, the first throes of the so-called communicative revolution took place. Out went translation and dictation, in came the 4 skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening. The concept of the sympathetic native speaker. Language fluency took precedence over your accuracy. Basically, we can see this one theory replacing another. This was a generative view of language, of a language acquisition device, rather than a behavioral or a structuralist view. Communicative language teaching, CLT. CLT. This is a typical communicative language teaching dialogue, and you were given this and to work with pupils. And maybe it's better than being dressed up as a chimpanzee, but it sets out, this is what the pupil has to do. Say hello to the shopkeeper. Bonjour, monsieur. Ask if he has any apples. Avez-vous des pommes? Order a kilo of apples. Je voudrais un kilo de pommes, s'il vous plaît. Order half a kilo of cheese. Je voudrais un demi-kilo de fromage. At that point, this was an exam, you had to extend the pupil, okay? You had to look for a more, higher level of language competence. And so you, as the teacher, would be clever and you would say, quel fromage? Le camembert? Or, I've lost the screen. It's on that screen. Anyway. The point I was going to make is that at that point, you would find that the pupil would say, you would say, quel fromage? And he would say, ça fait combien? How much is that? In other words, he wasn't really listening to you at all. You know? It was, in other words, a terribly prescriptive role play. So what we ended up with cliches, kind of walking phrase books. We often said, I was saying, I think last week, that we produced learners who were forever ordering meals that they were not going to eat, buying tickets to places they were not going to visit, and listening to people they were never going to meet. I knew that communicative language teaching didn't really work. So I move on. In some ways, it's quite easy to locate the language teaching methodology that I've been discussing, CLT, in terms of the scheme that I presented earlier. What you have again, you have CLT, communicative language teaching, providing the principles of practice, if you like. You have classroom practice at the top, and underneath that, you have the special sciences. And CLT itself was based on a lot of philosophy and psychology and sociology, which we could go into. So it did have theoretical bases, yeah? However, in practice, something else was involved, something based on my own experience. One of the first articles I wrote whilst in Southampton was entitled Communication, Sense in Nonsense. And this actually caused quite a stir over there. Here I describe the current methodological approach as being something like a grammatical sheep in communicative sheep's clothing, in order to highlight the way that much of what we were doing in the name of communication was no less repetitive than the old audiovisual approach, and no less accuracy-based in the old grammar translation methods, albeit that the materials now came dressed up in the full media package. Videos, photocopyable worksheets, computer programs, puppets, posters, comics. At the time, my own response to this situation was to propose a cyclic approach to language learning, with the underlying principles that guided methodology changing as the level of competence of the learner changed. So I had like stage 1 or cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3. And this pretty much related to what I did in the classroom. This is what I tried to make sense of. That actually when I had pupils in their kind of first year, we did a lot of kind of communicative work. Sensialization, you know, the type of role plays we were doing, very simple. They liked this very much. And then you kind of went through a second phase where you kind of raised some awareness about the structure of language, that French did have a structure and that, you know, there was a difference between grand and grande. And then finally you move through a cycle where you could give them the rule, look, there's feminine and masculine words, yeah? But actually, you had to phase that over a long period of time. And I'm talking about months and years. I'm not talking about days and weeks, yeah? And I was like everyone else when I trained to teach, you know? I thought, well, the teacher trainer said, well, if you teach people grammar, they don't really learn it. And you kind of look at them and go, yeah, but I'll explain it really carefully. They'll learn it when I do it. You know? So I'd kind of been through that and knew that it didn't work, really. So I'd had to adapt from my own practice. Where did these ideas of cycles, etc., come from? Not from deductive reasoning, but from actual practice itself. My response to the limitations and the failures of the methods I was attempting to realize in practice. In the course of 8 years in teaching, I'd had ample opportunity to make my mistakes and to learn from them, and also to learn from my pupils and with my pupils about what was happening to them in the process of acquiring another language. From my own reading, I later understood that this knowledge, from which I was drawing practical conclusions, was a kind of tacit knowledge, a hoarse sense of what to do and how to do it, built up through many thousands of hours of classroom practice. So in my diagram, I've included that now. You can see at the top, we have a kind of two-way relationship between actual practice. So CLT, if you like, is almost fed through my own tacit knowledge. This period in the 1990s saw two important developments in the UK. Firstly, the appearance of a national curriculum, and with it for the first time a fully prescribed scheme of work, in the case of modern languages now avowedly communicative. Secondly, the eclipsing somewhat of that very communicative approach. There was a search for something that gave more space to the learner, that allowed them to express themselves more effectively, that was less instrumental and more creative in its approach to languages. These issues were raised in a profession that was itself discussing and reflecting on its own practical experiences of applying the approach. Experiments with autonomous approaches were encouraging. And here, Trinity's own Sean Devitt and David Little were very influential to me, and I was a big fan of Authentique as a teacher in developing this approach to language teaching. However, it was clear that it was not enough just to be autonomous. In other words, to throw the dictionary to the learners and tell them to get on with it. They're independent now. Something else was needed. In my case, that something else was language learner strategies. Now, what I want to show you now is a poem, and it's a poem in Dutch. So does anyone speak Dutch? Does anyone understand Dutch? Okay, so I show you the Dutch poem. I show you the Dutch poem. Everyone can have a go at this. And the idea is you can work with your partner, bit of pair work now, to say what is the poem about. Okay, so you have to work with a partner and say what does this poem tell us? Here it is. I give you a couple of minutes to discuss it. Okay, so maybe you can call this out to me. The first line, what does this mean? An apple is red, yeah. The next one? Yep. The next one? Yep. The next one? Good. The cloud is white. Yeah, the earth is brown. Anyone have a go at the last bit? And now may I ask you, what colour is love? Love. Who said love? We got it right. Yeah. Right, I would say, my question to you there is, how did you know that then, if you don't speak Dutch? How did you know that? You use the pictures, yes. Anything else? Sorry? Very similar to English. Yes, this is cognates. There are words in cognates. Anything else? Germanic, yes. If you have some knowledge of German, you might pick something else. Anything else?
Once you get the first line, you know what it's about.
Voila, c'est ça, exactly. Once you get the first line, it starts setting up a pattern, okay? So you're all very good language learners, okay? So this is exactly what a language learning strategy is, or a learner strategy, is exactly that, making use of other bits of knowledge to help you learn the language. This approach to language learning was radically different in that rather than the teacher being the source of grammar, as in grammar translation, or the source of language to stimulate a language acquisition device, as in the communicative approach, it focused on language as a cognitive act, put simply as another form of information processing. Such processes need to be seen in terms of the mental manipulation of language, what happens when a learner encounters language. However, they also need to include thinking about such processes and experiences, the so-called metacognitive, as well as the socio-affective aspects of language learning. I eventually coined the phrase learning to learn in order to distinguish it from more conventional processes, to show that what was taking place here was not the direct teaching of languages, but the teaching of the ways and means to learn languages, a process in which the learner was an active participant. And this was the first book I did on this with my colleague V. Harris, Modern Languages and Language Learning. Interestingly enough, this research had been going on since the 1970s, but this was the first book that really dealt with it with respect to modern foreign languages rather than English as a foreign language. In the present context, the point I wish to stress is that such a development depended on a theoretical orientation as a set of principles to guide teaching and learning, but was practice and practitioner-led in that it arose from actual involvement, the development of tacit knowledge of a teacher and a teacher-educator. Now, the sorts of process that I'd gone through with that thinking, good students do this all the time in teacher education. So do master's students when they undertake pieces of action research. This is exactly what's going on. The results in both cases is genuinely thinking, reflecting teachers who bring both their intellectual and experiential knowledge to the job in hand. For this reason, I'm going to call this fundamental educational theory. It's fundamental because it's not fully developed in scientific terms. It's educational in that it arises from actual educational practice, and theoretical in that even in its undeveloped form, it still conforms to many of the characteristics of theoretical statements. For example, it's of use, it's potentially predictive, it can be articulated, it does have a degree of generality. Theory with a small t. But at the moment, this diagram seems to leave the sides separate from one another, with science and theory on the left and practice and teacher knowledge on the right. So let's complete the triangle. The arrows are a bit dark there, but I hope you can see that what I've actually put in there now are fundamental educational theory as a kind of triangle with arrows that point both ways. That we have the normal, the one that I showed before on the left-hand side with the scientific bases of educational principles, tacit knowledge, classroom practice, and this new fundamental educational theory, what I'm calling on the right-hand side, which is grounded in a philosophical way of thinking about knowledge. So fundamental educational theory on its own is not enough. It is important to make the connection, to revisit in a critically reflective manner educational principles of practice, educational theory, in the light of theoretical statements derived from practice, and maybe even connect with the theoretical bases lying behind those principles. In one sense, these positions can be seen as a journey from one place to another. They are certainly associated with specific times and places. However, it also needs to be seen as a return journey, travelling back and forth. Indeed, any one position is perhaps best seen as just an individual point of view, but one which is outward looking towards other positions, which it would be equally possible to occupy. For me, this begins to constitute a truly reflexive approach. Now, in the course of my own work in the UK, with UK polls and things like this, we used this work and this research to kind of develop our own strategy of intervention, if you like, into the field of education. So as a grouping, we took some of these ideas and we built up our own policy and practice to address an education profession. And what this included was being active on a number of levels. So we were active with teacher workshops, but we were also active with the same ideas at academic conferences. We published both in academic journals and professional journals. And we also held workshops and conferences orientated towards policy, to bring in the kind of writers of national curricula. And that strategy of intervention itself required a certain amount of planning and thinking. It wasn't just enough to kind of publish this stuff, talk about this stuff, and expect it to do its own work on its own. One had to be active in the field. So, to return to the general points of what I was saying about language learning earlier, in terms of the diagram as it stands, it is possible to connect the experiences of learning to learn with sociology and psychology in the bottom left-hand corner through the ideas of Vygotsky and sociocognitive theory. Indeed, it is more possible, it is necessary, if we are to develop a truly generative understanding of language learning and appreciate its implications for teaching, rather than simply arriving at a list of handy strategies for pupils to add, for teachers to add to their repertoire of teaching and for pupils to use in their repertoire of learning. And I have to say, in the UK context, a lot of these ideas were translated as just handy tips. And the point that we would make, and if you look at the Key Stage 3 strategy in England, is an example of the point is that we were talking about a fundamental reorientation of theory and practice. We weren't just talking about a few handy tips for learning languages. It was something that actually was based actually, that occupied the whole diagram, if you like. So far, this might seem quite a personal journey, albeit one undertaken in a professional context. But what relevance does it have for a larger educational audience? My work in research in teacher education are offered here as good examples of the tension between theory and practice. Traditionally, research into teacher education has shown that teachers do not like theory or research. This is as true for pre-service students as it is for in-service teachers. Some have no time for theories, see it as irrelevant to their practice, see their main job as focusing on real classroom action. In some respects, this is unsurprising. To return to my diagram, we can see that in pre-service teacher education, trainee teachers come with very little knowledge or experience which can be associated with any of the points indicated. Since the main challenge for a would-be teacher is to prove oneself in practice, it's not surprising that theory is regarded with some suspicion. In fact, this disposition simply is one side of a coin which has taken refuge in theory on the other side. It took me a long time to work out that when students that were just beginning in their teacher education, they very often said, it's all too theoretical. And I couldn't understand this because actually when I looked at what they were doing, it was full of classroom activities and, lesson plans. But what they meant was not so much that it was too theoretical. What they meant was that it was too ideal. It undermined the authenticity, the existential intensity of their daily experience, if you like. And that is true for practicing teachers as it is for pre-service teachers. And that's perhaps not surprising when you think of the thousands of personal exchanges that any teacher can encounter in a single day. In a way, theory sort of almost seems to undermine the authenticity of that. If there were time, perhaps we could explore together the three modes of theorizing of the triangle more fully in terms of teacher education. Its sociology, history, philosophy, and psychology, its guiding principles, its practice and tacit knowledge, its fundamental educational theory. I did do this in the first book I did, which was Training Teachers in Practice. Here I took a bunch of 12 teachers or students just beginning teacher education and followed them over the course of 3 years and tried to look at the experiences they had and try to make sense of the relationships that they formed, both in schools, in the university, with theory and with practice. They were kind of personal journeys, and it was based on my own PhD. One student said to me, in school, I thought you had the teacher, the book, and the pupil. With us, there was you, the communicative approach, and us. In other words, here, a particular educational theory, a principle of practice, became a medium of dialogue in theory and in practice. In other words, we developed a relationship between theory and practice through the medium of a particular theoretical perspective. What I discovered was that when theory moved out into the world, it encountered a wall of resistance, and practice was needed to pierce that wall. Yet theory is necessary in connecting one domain with another. Theory, in other words, can be more than an abstract expression of the ideal. It has the potential to function as an act of resistance, of an assertion of the personal over the public, as well as a collective position. The teachers I worked with showed that while they were engaging in a struggle of applying theory to practice and theorizing about their practice, they were making progress in understanding how to teach. This was often an extremely uncomfortable experience. Reflection for them was effortful. This was true for both ends of the spectrum, the successful and the unsuccessful. For me, when they had difficulties, they were still engaging. They were making progress. The student that just gave up, or the student that said everything was fine, was standing still. In a way, I felt later that this challenged a lot of thinking, quality assurance, that, the ideal is to have happy, satisfied students. Many of the times my students were not happy, they were not satisfied, they were struggling. But they were progressing. But these are generalizing statements, theoretical in their way, albeit in some fundamental way. What my research also showed was the necessity of looking at the particular in order to understand the actuality of educational processes in terms of its individual components and what they bring to any current context. In some, there is the necessity to develop a theory that is generative of a way of understanding that has practical usefulness, whilst preserving something of the existential authenticity of the elements and the actors involved. And for this, I needed the work of Pierre Bourdieu. This is a little montage of Bourdieu. I first met Bourdieu in 1979, just after he'd published La Distinction. I often like to say I knew Bourdieu before he became Bourdieu. Most of his books at the time were not published in English. The impact he had made is on sociology of education in the 1970s, the so-called new sociology of education. He was known as the cultural capital man. Okay. Since then, of course, there's been an explosion, a Bourdieu phenomenon, if you like, and his key terms, habitus, field, capital, are ubiquitous terms now. And they're used in a wide range of disciplines: philosophy, architecture, literature, politics, economics, arts, culture, geography, religion, and education. I myself have used some of these ideas to analyze the processes of classroom discourse, educational policy, and also the art field and aesthetics education. And I'm very glad that Cheryl Hardy is in the audience with us today, my co-author on art rules. I've also been alarmed at the way Bourdieu's ideas have been used. How easy, again, these metaphors pass into everyday. We know about that. Yeah. And what it results in, which is often what I call a weak form of constructivism. And so for the purposes of this lecture, I'd like to return to the principles which underlie them. What Bourdieu offered us is a theory of practice. It's worth pausing to reflect on this phrase. It's a theory of practice. What does that mean? Well, to begin with, Bourdieu always begins with a practical situation, often a naive view of something he has noticed or lived through himself. In the first book I did on Bourdieu, Agent Provocateur, I conjure up the image of Bourdieu, the photographer, a single image. One of them is when he's in the Béarn in his home village, and it's a Christmas dance. And he's looking around and everyone's celebrating and people are dancing. And he looks around, and around the side of the dance floor, there's a group of men. And they all seem to be the same age. And they're not dancing. They're just looking, watching the dance. And it's like a photo. Who are these men? What brought them here? And then similarly for him, he went to Algeria to do his national service during the time of civil war. And it was the same for him in Algeria, in the sense that he saw people in the street, these men who arrived in their bicycles, so say with their shop on the bicycle. And again, this photo, you can see the photos, he took photos. Who are these men? What produced them? What social forces produced them? Of course, in trying to answer that question, it took him sometimes decades to unpack through ethnography and statistics a whole bunch of data to actually explain, in the case of the Bayern, how the marriage strategies in southwest France really went against a certain strata of the population. And ditto in Algeria, how the displacements within Algeria had actually given birth to a new kind of social grouping, if you like. Behind that, very often with Bourdieu, there's a sense of suffering as well, of social suffering. And a lot of his work is trying to, I suppose, uncover the social forces that act on individuals in particular contexts. The empirical state is informed by and generates its own conventional ways of doing things. Just as my trainee teachers begin teaching on the basis of who they are, with little knowledge of principles in theory, this empirical way of existing in the world only involves reflection in an implicit way. For scientific knowledge, something needs to be made of the empirical. For Bourdieu, this something involved 4 breaks. So you have a break, we all exist in the empirical world. He wants to break from that. He wants to theorize about that, break from common sense. But he also wants to break from common forms of scientific knowledge, which, I mean, these are classified here as the phenomenological, the subjective, and objective knowledge. Now, we could see this in terms of the triangle I looked at earlier, in terms of formal theory underlying the left-hand side of the diagram, if you like, and also from the practice at the top, simple empirical knowledge. On the subjective side, we can place not only phenomenology, but all those approaches to research through individual experience. On the objective side, we have positivism, structuralism, and approaches that look to establish normative patterns of human behavior. Bourdieu is looking to go beyond both approaches. He had this term, what he was looking for was a science of dialectical relations between objective structures and the objective dispositions within which these structures are actualized and which tend to reproduce them. But what is this theory? What is it to see in this way? The key word for me in this is, sorry, that's oh, I missed one somewhere. Okay. The key word for me in this is structure. Structure is the primary cognitive act, the intentional relation that is set up between the individual and their surroundings. Structure in an individual act of perception. Structure in what is known and what is being seen. Structural relations between individuals and groups, and the structural relations of the group itself, and the group to the whole. The structure of institutions. Not surprising, one of my colleagues recently accused me of being a structuralist. But my form of structuralism is dynamic, I would argue. What Bourdieu's theory of practice enables us to understand are the links between these levels through structural homologies and the ways that principles of practice are articulated through the group to individuals and back again. So relational is the key word as well. We're not talking about substantive, we're talking about the relational. What this means, returning to my diagram, is that the positions listed do not exist in some impersonal, value-free realm. As I mentioned before, with my teacher educating students, it was possible to apply the triangle that we've been exploring here to any situation. So, for example, the student that was coming from a background of being bilingual French, she came with her own biographical dispositions, if you like. The way she responded to the theory, to the principles that were being offered her, were very much articulated through who she was, where she came from. I had another student who was a cosmetic consultant for Estée Lauder. I can remember when she turned up that day in her black BMW and her designer suit. And I said, but do you really want to be a teacher? But in the course of training, both of them, in the course of their teacher education, both of them, struggled, used what they were, where they were coming from, to articulate, to make sense of the experiences they had, the theories that were offered them in terms of the principles around which I was basing my course. But I want to say science, principles of practice, are the product of a science field and a political field. And both of those fields have interests. For example, embedded in curricular documents are institutionalized and orthodox ways of teaching, which are themselves articulated in particular site contexts, schools, departments, classrooms. Similarly, individuals, as I say, come with what Bourdieu called their own habitus, their biographical background, dispositions and ways of seeing and doing things. It's the interface of the context in the person, what Bourdieu called the field and the habitus, the alchemy of teaching and learning takes place. This is as true for classroom teaching as it is for teacher education, and in fact for any human activity. But I spoke before of 3 breaks, and a further one is needed, that from scientific knowledge itself. And I put that at the bottom there. Scientific knowledge on its own is insufficient to inform practice. It is common in the social sciences to adopt a so-called reflexive approach and to claim self-awareness and undertaking research projects, often as a way of discounting individual and particular interests in the object of research, which might risk skewing the outcomes. However, this temptation to transcend thought by thought itself is really no more than an assertion of one way of knowing over another. What of one researcher over another? What a Bourdieusian approach necessitates is that the researcher turns the tools of analysis of the theory of practice I've been illuminating in this talk back on the researcher themselves. You cannot use the triangle that I've been talking about this morning on somebody without looking at yourself in that process. Educational research often gets caught by the theory effect, where the theory becomes more real than the thing it purports to represent. And, as I've said, not only educational researchers, but by those with interests in the field. At the end of the day, bad science leads to bad policy. As I've noted, this can lead to theory ending up with a bad name. To avoid this, a reflexive approach conducts research while constructing its own analysis of the structure of the research field from which it is emerging, a kind of participant objectivation. Ways of seeing these points of view imply a certain construction of the research object. Even the aims and objectives of the education do this. Interests inherently are represented in constructions and are misrepresented or misrecognized. For example, the fact that theory itself represents first and foremost a break from empirical experience itself and is dependent on the construction of a separation from the real world. Implied in that, the schole, or the leisure, the relation that this position necessarily takes on. Ironically, a similar misrecognition in reverse is apparent when individuals assert the authenticity of practice over theory as a way of preserving their own worldview and the interests it involves. The sorts of relationship between theory and practice that I'm advocating, therefore, is above all reflexive, as it is only in reflexivity that we can establish a position that is both contingent and robust. Structure is at the heart of this reflexivity, in understanding the actuality of practice at any one particular point and time. The point of intervention in the field and the relations these give rise to. However, structure is also important in terms of the modes of knowledge inherent in such positionings and the interest each of these modes entails. And this takes up a line similar to Habermas, that a particular form of knowledge comes with a particular latent interest, if you like. Structures are not simply objects of knowledge, they imply relationships, both between individuals and the totality as a whole, and with the values underpinning them. In this way, our objective is not to simplify through theory, to take apart and hypothesize on the whole, but to begin with the whole, accept its complexity, and search for its organizing structures and the principles which underlie it. Much of my research on language, teacher education, art and aesthetics, policy, work from this necessity of seeing the whole, albeit in relation to the individual. The issue then is, what are our tools of analysis, our scientific instruments? What epistemological stance do they uphold? What language is logically necessitated by this approach? To conclude, I would like to consider the question of just what is the status of this educational knowledge, this way of knowing, the one that I'm referring to here. If it is not subjective, not objective, not tacit, not conventionally scientific, what is it? The simple answer might simply be, well, it's educational knowledge. But not just craft knowledge or the knowledge of the researcher. As I've argued, it is a reflexive knowledge, reflexive objectivity, structural but dynamically constructive. It is contingent but stable. It is a knowledge that has within it a radical doubt, but a doubt that is not tentative. It's a doubt that offers what we know as a kind of final vocabulary, to use the word, Richard Rorty's words. You know, this is the best we can do at this point in time. Originally, the triangle that I've been discussing here came from a little-known article by the educational phenomenologist Donald Vandenberg, published in 1974. I'm showing this now as a disclosure and as a completion of something that was begun almost 20 years ago. It demonstrates what practice of theory about practice might look like. This is somebody engaged with somebody else discussing this text. This was 1990. Many times, many hours on 2 pages. It's part of a process of individuals trying to understand, conflicting, contesting. As I say, many times spending many hours on just 2 pages. It's messy and exploratory. That is the real relationship between theory and practice. What this encounter generated has guided much of my subsequent research, and more recently, my work with research students. What is gained from this exploration is knowledge that is more than in the head, an intellectual game. The French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty wrote of the embodied state of knowing. It is incorporated in the body. It is not only an intellectual activity, but an epistemological matrix that involves one's whole being, an epistemology that becomes an ontology, if you like. The sorts of terminology that I've used here, the thinking tools, or instruments of analysis like educational theory, tacit knowledge, fundamental educational theory, habitus and field, and the relationships between them are not simply theoretical metaphors, but they imply generative ways of thinking and doing in the world. This, we could describe, is a kind of metanoia, a new way of seeing the world, or at least the educational world. And here, the scientific impacts on the empirical self. At the beginning of my lecture, I referred to the debate between theory and practice. It is my firm conviction that this debate, this dialogue, must continue. But that is our communal task. To become a community of practice, that dialogue involving educational practitioners, both intra-departmentally and interdepartmentally, similarly endowed with working the world in these terms. Such an activity, knowing the world in this way, would truly best be summed up not only as a theory of educational practice, but a practice of educational theory. Thank you.
Was brought to you by Trinity College Dublin. For further information, please visit our website itunes.tcd.ie.